Chess is boring. Chess is lame. Chess is for nerds and virgins. This was the stigma the game had when I was growing up. I'm not saying this to reflect my own feelings towards chess, because I played chess as a kid. I remember being in middle and high school, and chess was not the cool activity to be a part of. Maybe it's because kids were meaner back then, but chess was viewed as boring and dorky. For those of us who play the game, and who have maybe even gone to a few tournaments, we know that chess is far from boring, and the game itself can sometimes be even more intense than actual sports. But the majority of the public, especially here in the United States, didn't know about this side of the game until the recent chess boom a few years ago. This massive upsurge in popularity was in large part due to Netflix's hit show, The Queen's Gambit. But how did this show manage to take a seemingly mundane activity and create one of the greatest, most universally liked shows around it? And how did the show find favor from both chess players and people who had never even learned the game? The Queen's Gambit took a massive risk, and this risk deserves to be talked about and appreciated. In this video, I'm going to break down the 3 underlying reasons as to what makes the Queen's Gambit so great amongst both chess players and newcomers, and how it makes something typically not associated with fun extremely entertaining. So without any further ado, let's get into the Queen's Gambit. The day is July 10th, 1884. It's extremely hot, and a few hours past the afternoon, a grisly discovery will be made. An elderly woman knocks on the bathroom door, where her son takes his regular daily bath. She knocks, but to no avail. She tries the door, and fortunately, it's unlocked. She walks in the room and sees her son unconscious in the bathtub. His hands grip the sides of the bathtub, while his head rests on the edge. The mother, worried as any parent would be, immediately gets a doctor. The doctor tries his best to get the man in the tub back to a conscious state, but all of his attempts fail, and his body lies there, lifeless. This man in the tub was none other than Paul Morphy, a man renowned for his chess genius, and who was indisputably the best player of his time, and easily on the Mount Rushmore of the greatest chess players ever. Fast forward to October 23rd, 2020. Viewers tune in for the premiere of The Queen's Gambit, and what's the first thing they're greeted with? Knocking on a bathroom door just before the heroine grabs the tub and pulls herself up out of the darkness. Where one prodigy's story ends, another begins. This is just one example of the several real-life chess stories that are incorporated and retold through the character that is Beth Harmon. This is also the first reason I want to point out for the Queen's Gambit's success, and this is how the show draws on its real-life chess inspirations. The most obvious parallel in the show to a real-life player is that of Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer was an extremely talented player who single-handedly took out the Russian powerhouse that dominated the 20th century. This is an insane accomplishment, and it's frequently cited as the primary argument for Bobby Fischer's case for being the greatest or most talented player of all time. Beth Harmon does this exact same accomplishment, and at roughly the same time as Fischer. In the show, Harmon beats Borgov in 1968, whereas Fischer beat Spassky in 1972. But besides his talent for the game, Bobby Fischer would go on later in life to become a recluse, and many speculated that he was suffering from mental illness. There's a very thin line between genius and crazy, and that is a constant motif that's brought up in the Queen's Gambit. But the similarities with Fischer don't end here. Bobby had a complicated relationship with his mother, Regina. Regina was a brilliant woman who is said to have known 6 to 8 languages, and she studied medicine in Moscow before working in the United States. She left her husband, who was the father to Bobby and his sister, Joanne, and she scraped a living to support her children by working as a nurse and an elementary school teacher. Regina was a brilliant woman, but she was also known to be paranoid, and honestly rightfully so, because the FBI suspected her of being a Russian spy, a claim that later turned out to be false. But the comparisons between Regina and Alice Harmon are quite clear. Alice Harmon leaves her husband with her child just like Regina. Alice is also shown to be a brilliant woman, but just like Regina, she suffers from mental illness. The children, Bobby and Beth, then have to overcome their parents and the mental health issues they had. A large part of the suspense in The Queen's Gambit is whether Beth will be able to break out of the trauma she has, or if she will end up like Fischer. It's also been speculated by some that Bobby Fischer had a problem with alcohol. When he was jailed in Japan in 2004 for trying to use an invalid passport, he cited the lack of alcohol as the cause for a deterioration in his health. Fischer is speculated to maybe have some issues pertaining to substances, but other grandmasters and famous world champions are known for a fact to have some serious problems with various substances. Russian grandmaster and 4th world champion Alexander Alekhine is known to have a drinking problem, and one of his nicknames would become Ale in wine. The first US chess champion was a man by the name of Charles Henry Stanley, and he would go on to become an intense alcoholic. Stanley had a match with the great Paul Morphy, and after their match, which Morphy had won, Morphy gave his $100 prize to Stanley's pregnant wife because he knew that Stanley was spending all of his money on drinking. Stanley would spend the last 20 years of his life in and out of New York hospitals due to alcoholism. Substance abuse is the biggest idea brought up constantly throughout The Queen's Gambit, and in my opinion, the show is just as much about substance abuse as it is about chess. The show constantly lingers on the harms of addiction and how Beth's vices might be her downfall, just like with these real-life chess players that I mentioned before. The last real-life player I'll bring in to compare to Beth Harmon is Judith Polgar, who is considered to be the greatest female chess player ever. Polgar broke the record in 1991 for being the youngest grandmaster when she accomplished this feat at the age of 15 years and 4 months. That accomplishment has been beaten since, but it was a big deal when Polgar pulled it off, especially since the record that she broke was that of Bobby Fischer, who became a GM at the age of 15 years and 6 months. Polgar would go on to become a very strong and fierce player, but that didn't come without its tribulations. Polgar was commonly overlooked, and she faced a lot of sexism, but she never failed to rise to the challenge. Ever since a young age, Polgar always elected to play in the men's events rather than playing events with women only, and this obviously resulted in a lot of stares and attention from her competition, who tended to underestimate Polgar. Players would sometimes decline to even shake Polgar's hand after they lost to her, and she was not allowed to play in some tournaments due to her gender. This bravery and ferocity that Polgar had can be seen in Beth, who clearly battles with a lot of prejudice throughout the show due to her being a woman. Although some have said that they think the show doesn't have enough sexism to be accurate to the time period, but the show still has elements of it, and it clearly relates Beth Harmon to Judith Polgar. These references and nods to chess history is something that The Queen's Gambit does really well, and it keeps the references subtle and in good taste, making the recognition of a reference feel rewarding for those who are familiar with the game. But you don't need to understand these real-life references to appreciate the show, and these references are tied in so well that you may not even notice them at first, because of how seamless this show is. And this brings me to my second reason for The Queen's Gambit's success, and that is that it's easy to follow. The story of The Queen's Gambit is not overly complex, and the show presents the events in a really easy way to digest and follow along. The show has multiple timelines, but it never feels convoluted. On top of this, The Queen's Gambit is easy to grasp for people who have never played chess. As I mentioned before, I have a history with chess, but my friends who didn't know how to play the game loved the show just as much as I did, maybe even a little bit more than me, and this speaks to how The Queen's Gambit bridges the gap between chess players and people who have no history with the game. The show is able to convey the intensity of the game to its watchers who don't play chess through its acting and shot selection. The players will frequently look directly into the camera, and you can see their emotions progress gradually throughout the game. Things like breathing and occasional shaking are used to indicate the player's nerves. The soundtrack follows the state of the game and reflects it so the audience knows which moments are turning points in the match. The show even has Beth's calculations on the ceiling, so the audience can understand what Beth's thinking. I mentioned it before, but I want to reiterate on how simple and straightforward the story of the Queen's Gambit is. The show doesn't have many crazy twists or turns, but the beauty of the plot of the Queen's Gambit lies in its simplicity. Each event seems to naturally flow in the narrative, and the pacing of the show is really well done. The themes are clearly presented, and while the show is far from being realistic, it puts a nice spin on an activity that is generally underappreciated. The other aspect that makes the Queen's Gambit so easy to watch is just how well the show is shot and how visually pleasing it is. And this brings me on to my third and final reason as to how the Queen's Gambit managed to make something typically not associated with fun extremely entertaining. The show is incredibly satisfying to watch. Everything about the Queen's Gambit oozes beauty when it comes to the show's visuals and cinematography. There's a fantastic article written by Thomas Lafley over on The Vulture that goes over what makes the Queen's Gambit so mesmerizing to look at. I'll be referring to this article for this section of the video, but I highly suggest giving it a read since it's super insightful. The first element that Lafley points out is how the Queen's Gambit is framed through Harmon's point of view, and we frequently see what she would see throughout the show. The framing of the show is always centered around her, and if each frame is thought of as a painting, then she is the subject of each composition. The visuals play around her personality and predicaments, and a great example of this occurs during a phone call between Beth and Benny Watts. The stares surround Beth, almost as if she's in a mental prison, and this matches up with what she's experiencing at this point in the story. Dutch angles, these tilty shots, are frequently used to suggest Beth's mental state and to invoke a sense of imbalance. The show also has impeccable long takes that are just so visually pleasing to watch, and these long takes give immersion into the world of the show. Another detail that I really like, and that Lafley points out, is how the show ends with a handheld camera to indicate Beth's connection to the camera work, and how she has finally grounded herself and taken control over her issues and mental struggles. The shot also connects us to her personally, and we finally get a feeling that we are walking beside her, rejoicing in her triumphs. We feel a personal connection to her, and the use of this handheld camera helps bridge the gap from audience to character. This is just a brief breakdown of the satisfying elements of the Queen's Gambit that makes it a pleasure to watch, but there's definitely a lot more to be discussed about this. But the point remains that the show's immersion and stunning visuals definitely play a part in making the show so universally liked and watchable. The last thing I want to say on the note of the show being so satisfying is a pretty stupid comparison, but nonetheless I think it can be helpful. You know those oddly satisfying videos that always manage to get millions of views and are easy to binge? Well, those videos demonstrate that we often don't need a narrative to keep watching something as long as we find it visually mesmerizing. The Queen's Gambit obviously offers a narrative, but its drama is not edge-of-your-seat thrills like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones. But the Queen's Gambit compensates by giving a beautiful presentation, and this paired with a simple but elegant story provides for an incredibly smooth watching experience that keeps you hooked. Overall, Netflix took a massive gamble when they decided to adapt the 1983 novel, The Queen's Gambit, into the show that has now become an icon of the miniseries format and shows overall. The show found a way to connect with all audiences, and it provides a viewing experience that resonates with chess players and newcomers. The show rewards those who understand the game and the history behind it, but it also has plenty of material that doesn't hinge itself on the viewer having a prior understanding of the chess world. The three aspects that I mentioned throughout the video, like the real-life inspirations, easiness to follow, and the satisfaction of the show, are all crucial elements behind the Queen's Gambit's success. The show, of course, would be a huge part of the chess boom that would follow where it felt like everybody and their grandma was getting into the game, and as a longtime chess fan, when this happened, I couldn't be any happier. The Queen's Gambit is an incredible show, and hopefully this retrospective was somewhat insightful. But there you have it, some of the best die that Netflix ever rolled, The Queen's Gambit. Alright guys, that's all I have for this video. Please let me know your thoughts on the Queen's Gambit in the comments below. I'm a one-man band over here, and this video took a long ass time to make, so all the support you guys provide by liking the video and all that stuff seriously means a lot to me. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to check out some of my other stuff. I put in a lot of time on these videos, and I try my best to make original content over things that haven't been covered before. But as always, if you made it this far, thank you, I love you, and I genuinely hope that you have a great rest of your day.